Welcome everyone, this is going to be a very quick demonstration and run through of an Infernalist Demon Form build. As you can see here, this relies on the permanent Demon Form at max 10 Demon Flame. Before going into the details, I'll just quickly load in a map, do just a nice simple T12 for now, although this build as it currently stands I have run through T14s as well. Just give everyone an idea of what it looks and feels like. One of the things you'll notice is very easy to play, very quick and very tanky. Rares melt. More often than not, we can just rely on using Spark solely by itself, but there are also combinations for rare mobs and bosses which really ramp up the damage to significant amounts. But I think that's enough to give you guys an idea. So, as I mentioned, biggest benefits of this build, I would say, are that it is very, very quick due to the Demon Form dodge ability. It's very tanky. Basically, in Demon Form here, you can see I have a almost 6,000 energy shield. This build also runs Mind Over Matter, which I'll go into more detail with later and as to why, but that 2000 is also an effective HP pool, so we're effectively running at about 6, 2, 1, almost 9,000 HP. It's also very cheap and easy to put together. I am playing on solo self-found, so very easy to get all the pieces. And as you can see, the DPS is definitely a viable endgame. Ability-wise, you could see there, it focuses basically around the Spark build, which you see a lot of Stormweavers and other Sorceress builds running. Main damage ability is Spark, and we have a number of different abilities to complement it and to ramp up its damage. Going over the abilities then, so Spark itself, as you can see, does a lot of damage, a lot of projectiles, especially once you start getting extra quality into it as well. Then we have a lot of supplementary abilities which basically all serve to increase the damage of Spark. The first of which is, which you would see me personally using quite a lot when I encounter a rare mob and on all boss fights, is Mana Tempest. This ability gives you 86 at level 24 in Demon Form, extra multiplicative damage. We're also getting 15% more damage from premeditation, and it also gives you culling strike, so that's effectively also a damage boost because this will kill any regular mobs below 30, magic at below 20, etc. So very handy support gem as well. Archmage, we can actually run, we have enough spirit to run this and enough mana regen and mana pool to actually make it viable. This actually has some bit of extra quality into it. I think at a quality of 0 this gives you 6% per 100 mana. But at the moment you can see here I'm getting 140% multiplicative damage again. So Mana Tempest with it's almost more than 100 multiplicative damage. Then you got Archmage as well, which is passively giving you 100. We've got conductivity. This is basically pretty much only ever used on lightning resistance rares as well as bosses. Basically, if you're not aware, this will lower a mob's resistance below 0, so basically another source of multiplicative damage. And we have Flame Wall. This is basically used only on bosses. I find using it during maps creates too much ground clutter to see, and be able to avoid dangerous ground effects from enemies, especially in higher maps. But basically any spark that passes through the flame wall gets another 90 to 129, because you can see here, gets a bit of flame fire damage. Basically all the supports here deal with just increasing the size of it. I like to run Fortress with Spell Cascade, and Persistence basically just makes it take up a whole bunch of space, especially in a boss arena, always guaranteeing every spark to pass through it. Ice Nova, this is basically something I picked up to use after getting swamped quite a few times in the early days. It's basically a get out of jail free ability. If you ever get surrounded by melee, this will basically push them all off you a little bit and generally give you enough space to then dodge out of it. Orb of Storms is an ability which, along with Mana Tempest, used quite regularly, especially for rare mobs. Basically, this at the moment serves two purposes. Firstly, it's an extra source of DPS. Any spark that passes through this, which, remember, you're throwing around a lot of sparks. It fires off another lightning bolt, which does extra damage, and it chains as well. So, another good map clearing ability. And all the supports here, which I'll touch on now, are basically serving, especially on bosses, as a big debuff source. So I didn't go over the shock supports, which I'll jump back to in a moment, but basically this is my source of lightning exposure. So basically applying lightning exposure with the orbs, increasing the effect, making the orb larger so more sparks pass through it, and also applying shock. So jumping back up to Spark, very important when running Archmage and just to help with your mana regen issues, inspiration, reduce the cost. More cast speed, basically another multiplicative source of damage. Obviously not multiplicative of other sources of a cast speed, but just in general. 25% more elemental damage. We're not applying shock through Spark. During mapping, honestly, mobs die so quickly that you don't really need shock, so having it applied through orb on bosses, I find the uptime is more than sufficient. And lastly, controlled destruction, which basically we're not relying on crit. Once we get to the passive tree, you'll notice there's basically no sources of crits, so basically this is another multiplicative source of damage. So before we jump into the passive tree and other intricacies of the build, well, probably the most important thing to highlight is the one core piece of equipment for this build is this chest piece. And the big reason for that is to be able to sustain the demon form indefinitely without needing to invest many passive nodes into life regen or anything like that. And the big thing here is the 50% of mana life converted to energy shield. So this is just amazing for this build. Firstly, the demon form. Demon form, for those that aren't aware, you lose 0.5% of your life per second per demon flame. So capped at 10, that is effectively 5% of your life per second. So if, as you can imagine, the larger your health pool is, the larger that figure is. Most of the passive nodes within the passive tree deal with percentages as well, but to be able to get that 5% isn't a massive investment, but it's big enough that you really don't want to waste passive points on that. And what this chest does by reducing your health pool, as you can see here, I've got 790. To make the math a bit easier, if we round out up to 800 and take 5% of that, it basically means we need 40 health per second to be able to sustain the 10 stacks of demon form. And that is actually very easy to achieve in gear. So as you can see here, I'm achieving that through two pieces, this head and belt, where we got 22.5 life regen per second and 17.5. So actually slap on the 40 there. And as you can see here, I'm sitting in demon form and my health isn't moving. So very important chest piece. I'm playing on solo self-found, so I'm not sure how much this costs on standard league on trade, but don't imagine it being too expensive, hopefully. All the other stats on this are also great for this build. Energy shield, obviously, we're stacking. Chaos resistance, very hard to come by, so that's fantastic. And the actual conversion of the health into energy shield itself is significant. You're basically getting 800, like I said, roughly base energy shield from this chest piece itself due to that conversion. How all that ties in with the passive tree and how we're making all of this work. Starting with the Ascendancy, obviously we're taking demon form with the max 10 demon flame. We're also picking up altered flesh. Big reason for this is mostly for the physical damage taken as chaos damage. We don't have a lot of armor, so basically being able to mitigate a little bit of the physical damage with chaos damage is very helpful. There is one little caveat with that, in that chaos damage does bypass your energy shield, so if you don't have enough mana regen coupled with Archmage, things can get a little bit tricky in terms of mana regen, but personally I find this very handy to take. Alternatively, you could run the Hellhound. I find it dies far too quickly to serve any use. You could just take simply these maximum mana nodes and not take anything else. The other benefit of going through Altered Flesh is I don't have the 7th Wave Ascendancy yet, but being able to take one of these conversions would also be handy, probably 2 mana to increase the benefit of Archmage. In terms of the passive tree, we can almost capture it all in one screen. But basically, you'll notice that with the exception of the lightning nodes up here and some of the elemental nodes over here, everything else is pretty much centered around buffing the energy shield and getting enough mana regen to sustain Archmage, the cost of Archmage, which I didn't highlight. If you're not aware, Archmage adds 5.25% of your mana per cast, which is pretty big. So, yeah. So basically you can see here, energy shield, buffing the max mana to also get maximum benefit out of Archmage, converting energy shield to mana, which I'll come back to while we pick this up again. Since we're also running energy shield, this may feel a bit counterintuitive. Intelligence, more mana, more elemental damage, bit of elemental resistances here, energy shield with mana regen. These are very handy nodes. This is all mana regen here with also 2 added benefits. Arcane Surge, I find you don't need to really rely on it. Don't need to take I find taking it as a support in Spark is a bit of a waste. And on bosses, when you do maybe need a little bit of a boost, Orb sometimes actually procs this itself with its critical hits. Minor over matter, important one over here. As I touched upon earlier, one thing to be very aware of with Energy Shield is that Chaos damage bypasses it. We're already taking extra Chaos damage here through Altered Flesh, but also things like poison, counters poison, Chaos damage. So if we have only 800 life, any damage that bypasses this shield, we don't want to be too susceptible to. So as I mentioned, the energy shields counts as your first line of defense, and then you've got another extra 2,000 basically HP sitting here to counteract any chaos damage you take. Or likewise, any just surprise burst that pops straight through the energy shield. Eldritch Battery here, I actually picked this up for two purposes. One, there's enough energy shield already in this build that losing I think at this stage I have about 400 energy shield on my gear, which equates after all the other buffs to about another, I think, 1,200 odd energy shield. I actually find more benefit in the extra 400 mana I get from that. Basically, that 400 mana ends up being an extra 4 times 7 in my case, Archmage, multiplicative damage. Also, it means more mana is more regen, so it makes it easier to actually sustain your mana with Archmage. So it's all win-wins, personally. Completely optional though, if you want more energy shield, can drop this. Keep in mind we're also running Minor Than Matter, so more mana is more HP anyway, so taking the 1,200 in my case off of here for about 400 more here actually ends up being a net loss of only about maybe 700-800 effective mana, health pool. Nodes over here, probably another one to call out is this one's very, very handy. Obviously, big amount of energy shield, and one more key thing here being again, more reduced maximum life, and hence needing less life regen to sustain your demon form. Like I said, everything else pretty much centers around mana regen and energy shield. The only real damage nodes we take, like I said, are here, the elemental damage, some cast speed, and Ores, so again, a bit more defense as well. And then here, taking just lightning damage. We're stacking a lot of int, so a lot of spell damage from there, and a bit of extra, basically, penetration and exposure for bosses. So that pretty much covers the passive tree. Go over into gear. Like I said, all of this gear was solo self-found in my case, and it is, well, pretty horrible. Well, not ideal, maybe not horrible, but far from optimized. Obviously the key piece being this chest. Basically, we need 2 pieces to hit our required life regen. So you can see here, life regen on at least 2 of your pieces here. I think rings and amulets can roll it as well. The other stats you're looking for effectively after that are max mana being the priority from a DPS perspective. Basically, more mana means better regen and more Archmage multiplicative damage. And after that, well, arguably even more, maybe first before the mana is solving your resistance needs. As you can see here, I was running a T12, I have run T14s, and my resistances are far from maxed out, and this build pretty much tanks most things. It's pretty much the only things worth really highlighting here. Feel free to pause on any of these pieces. Like I'll stress, they are far from great. Decent max mana roll on this one. The only other interesting piece here, which I personally run, completely optional, but I find it just complements this build so well, is Everlasting Gaze. As you can see here, you're basically getting 80% additive mana regen, which is pretty significant. That typically equates to around seven or eight passive nodes, or maybe a bit less, but either way, for Archmage helps a lot. But another big one here is we're basically getting a lot of energy shield from HP being half the conversion, and then we're getting another big stack of energy shield from mana, which we're also stacking. So that's why we can get this shield really high up there. Like I said, without Eldritch Battery and suboptimal gear, this shield can I can personally get it up to about 7,500. You know, if you don't run this though, you can use the amulet as well for solving your resistances, getting more max mana. So, like I said, completely optional. That about covers it. Probably the only other thing to highlight there, in terms of combos, like you saw, running through a normal map, most white mobs you can just deal with Spark by itself. If you encounter a slightly tougher mob, you can pop your Mana Tempest, does more damage, about 2 times as much damage. After Mana Tempest, you throw down your orb, that's not enough. Oh, as you can see there, mana issues of Archmage. Need to keep moving around as well with this build due to this node here, which is worth highlighting, 50% mana regen rate while moving. So like I said, Spark first stage, second stage, Mana Tempest, next stage, Orb, lastly, Firewall. Firewall I'll typically reserve just for bosses, because as you can see, once you throw that down, it really does clutter your screen and makes it hard to see everything. Finally on boss as well, you can throw down the Curse. Well, that about covers it. Apologies for the rough nature of the video, doing this just in one take just to get something out there and show you guys. Hope you enjoy, have fun with the build, very easy to set it up like I said, and all the best.